welcome to the Houston 2020 Visions lecture series. Tonight we are focused on rethinking hubs, and I'm excited to welcome everyone. And if you can see my background, that is from earlier today where we hosted Mayor Turner at our brand new Architecture Center, Houston, downtown. And we walked through together to see the new exhibit that is on display. If you've made it to our presentation tonight, you may be aware that it is on our website, available for viewing at houston2020visions.org. And so we encourage you to go visit that, and soon it will be available for visiting in person through appointments with limited capacity people. So on to the show tonight. I'm excited to introduce Illya Azaroff, a celebrated architect focused on disaster mitigation, resiliency planning, strategies, and design. He has become a dear friend over the years and has been extremely supportive of our efforts to create toward a more resilient future for Houston and our region. And we are so thankful for his participation, lending his expertise and advice to our community over the years. He specifically related to this, he has participated as a juror on the Houston 2020 Visions exhibit and really helped craft the exhibit that you see. So with that, I'll hand it over to Illya.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And it's so great to be here tonight. It's such a pleasure. If you hear some background noises emanating from behind me, I'm in a field office, but I did want to say I'm really thankful for being here. And I wanted to thank AI Houston, as well as the city of Houston, for including me in all of these wonderful efforts that have been going forward. And so we're at this moment of a rise to resilience. And I think many in Houston and those listening in have experienced this, wherever that tipping point was, whether it was, Hurricane Maria for Puerto Rico, or Katrina for New Orleans, or Hurricane Sandy for New York City, New Jersey. Harvey was the tipping point for Houston. And maybe you call it a wake-up call, whatever you think about. We understood very clearly and succinctly that you can't go back to the way it was. There is no possibility that what we were doing before can continue into the future. And so what I was grateful for is to be included in this process and to bring some of my ideas and expertise and learn from many of you who are perhaps on this call who participated in the Visions 2020. And some of those things we're going to just briefly talk about this evening. So first and foremost, a couple of things about resilience hubs. It's not often that we come to a place that we recognize historically something new in architecture. Now, there have been forms of hubs in the past. In fact, when we think about hubs, they're buildings that operate before, during, and after a disaster. They are ready, or they're steady state assets that we often rely upon for local emergency management and city officials or communities. And the creation of resilience hub networks has been identified as an essential component all across the world for cities that need to find a better way forward. And one of the clusters that emerged from this incredible effort for Visions 2020 was this hub typology. And there were several submissions that began to look at hubs. So I'm going to leave that for our jurors to discuss some of these elements. But the piece that I want to mention here at the onset is what was new in this process was that the new hub typology that everyone is seeking and working on, it conceptualized sort of an innovative construct that not only protects communities before, during, and after disaster, not just sheltering people, but it also regenerates the city, its environment, its economies, and rediscovers what is called a uniqueness of place. So I'm hoping to hear a little bit about that tonight. But let me tell you about the jury process. So when we all flew into Houston to talk about and take a look at all of the amazing entries that were there, this was not a competition. This was something about an evaluation of the ideas that were out there to seek out clusters, synergies, and common threads that really brought innovation forward, new ideas. Because remember what I said, you after a tipping point, you can't go back to the way it was. You've gone over that apex, and everyone realizes what's next for us is how we define our future. And so this is a moment for communities, government, the design industry to all come together and say the new way forward needs to be found. And in the pool of submissions, we did find various clusters and synergies and common threads. Um, in effect, once we found those clusters as jurors, those robust discussions really then examined, um, are we creating a vision of the future, or are we really looking at something that is more immediate? So that brought us to this idea of what a time scale is. Are we looking at immediate needs versus long-term synergies? And that also was something we discussed in Band-Aids. Are we looking for something that is an immediate need that is just going to stop the bleeding as part of what has to happen after a disaster? Or are we trying to think beyond of transformation into the future? So these are the conversations we had. But the other element that came up quite strongly in these submissions were this idea of culture of place. So I said uniqueness of place. That was something about geography, um, what it means to be from various parts of Houston, the ecosystems, the geographies of people who live there, the socioeconomic circumstances. But then this culture of place drills deeper down into the historic elements and asking the question, who's the community that is being served here, and how can that community elevate into the future to become self-reliant as well as quite resilient on their own. And those were some of the elements that came through the jury process. I won't belabor that, but I have to tell you, the people that were involved from the city, from the design industry, and from all around the U.S. that came together for this were quite impressed and quite dedicated to making Houston a resilient, incredible place in the future. So before I turn it over to my colleagues to give you this incredible background, and I'm sorry for my background, all of the noise that you might be hearing, is that uh, I would like to again thank AI Houston for this opportunity, the City of Houston, and the Stantec team, who I've had the good opportunity to work with. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to my colleagues. Um, Laura Sachtleben will be speaking first. She's a senior principal with Stantec, and she'll be presenting the LilyPad network. And she'll be followed by Shannon Buggs, who's the director of the Mayor's Office of Complete Communities at the City of Houston. And with that, thank you very much, and thank you for being here this evening to really look at this new typology and new ways of becoming whole again.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Illya. It's such a pleasure to be able to be here tonight as well, to get to present the LilyPad network to you guys. This is a labor of love of a lot of people. I myself am an architect by trade, focused on education design, but I have colleagues who are urban planners, housing architects, landscape architects, water engineers. And what's so exciting about Houston 2020 Visions as a program is that it was really seeking out holistic solutions. And so that's what our team strove to do. And of course, we engaged many, many more people outside of our organization, to try to come up with the most holistic response and vision of our future that we could. The LilyPad network itself, it's really a concept that capitalizes on existing community assets. It recognizes the fact that when we're dealing with resilience, there are a lot of needs and limited dollars sometimes to handle those needs. And so it's finding a way to capitalize and build up what we already have, and so sometimes that can be, when we're talking facilities, it can be schools, community centers, faith centers, and really rethinking them as safe havens or hubs, or as this concept envisions them as lily pads. And what's really important is that they're tethered both to their local communities, but also tethered to each other to imagine this much larger network that can respond more actively to threats and stresses. Next slide. So many of us know all too well and remember Hurricane Harvey. And of course, that was a major catalyst for the conversation in general. And we remember all the devastation around us, and we remember the numbers, the $125 billion in damages. And that's important. You know, we need to classify, we need to understand that damage. And so a lot of times it's that dollar value of damages that we turn to, and it helps us understand how large the impact was. Go to the next slide. But what we need to remember is that at its core, resilience is about people, and that many of us have our own stories about Hurricane Harvey. You know, I myself, this is a picture of my two kids in a raft that our neighbor blew up so that we could float them across the street and try to make it a somewhat entertaining experience and not all traumatic. But as you talk to people, you realize that that's what we all remember, that it's the human response to these things that's important, and that we need to address that. Next slide. And so at its core, you know, we have to recognize that social equity and community contribute to resilience. And that's what we were trying as we thought about resilience hubs and the LilyPad network. We wanted to keep that at its core, understanding that we're bolstering the community itself in order to help them bound forward in the future. Next slide. And so when we start the LilyPad process or the analysis, the first thing we do is we look at the threats and stresses that we face. You know, of course, Harvey makes us all think about flooding, but the intent is that it's going to react to any threats and stresses that a community might face. So mobility is something to think about. Poverty is something to think about. You know, we talk a lot about living, you know, dealing with flooding, but we also have to realize that drought is a real possibility. And so, you know, we can't just look at our threats and stresses of today. Those are going to change over time. And so we need to be able to step outside of where we are today and imagine what we might face in the future as well. Next slide. And again, at its core, it's about people. And what we know is that strong, culturally diverse communities where people know and respect each other, they fare better when they face distress or disaster. And so the social aspects of resilience are just as important as that physical response. And that's something we wanted to keep at the core of this concept. Next slide. And we also need to remember, because we're talking about people, we have to remember that it's about relationships. Those that fare better are those that have a network and relationships and not independence. Next slide. And so as we started to unpack these threats, we wanted to look at it at each scale. We wanted to look at it through the lens of human needs. What are the things that we need? If we take flooding as an example threat, what are the things that we need at the individual scale? You know, we need access to information and data. We need preparedness education as individuals, because we may not always have other people there to help us in an emergency, depending on the size. And then you have things like shelter and social connections. And so we start to assess those human needs at each scale. We look at the neighborhood scale, we look at the community scale, and then ultimately we look at the city scale and beyond. Next slide. And then we also need to realize that, you know, while we can talk about Houston as a whole, we know that there's distinct challenges in our communities in and around Houston, and they have unique challenges. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that if we look at one neighborhood and we start to break down the data and some of the statistics of that neighborhood, you start to see that they may have very different challenges from another neighborhood. One neighborhood may deal with a lot of flooding, may have a lot of mobility issues. If we go to the next slide, in another neighborhood, they have a different set of challenges. And so the interventions in those neighborhoods need to be very different, and they need to be prioritized based on the needs of those communities. Next slide. And so when we talked about the network, we wanted to, it's both a structure and an approach. And so when you're looking at the approach, it's about first and foremost, engaging with the communities, engaging both with the local communities and larger stakeholder groups to really understand the specific needs, and educate on what is out there, what grants, what funds are available. It's about identifying the shocks and stresses, of course, prioritizing those things, and realizing what are the critical things that we need to address first. Evaluate, of course, then you go into the planning phase, finalize what your plan is, and then always, after implementation, coming back and rechecking it. And this is something that is ongoing. I think something that we know about resilience is it's not something that you do and check the box and say you're done, because we know that it's not static, it's ever evolving. And then we kind of, we took the lily pad concept, and really kind of, to understand it, we kind of broke it down to a structure. And so if, on the surface of a lily pad as a plant, what you see are these individual lily pads. And on the surface, it looks like they're all very independent. But what the strength of the lily pad is that it's actually this network below the surface that is holding it all together, and making it thrive. And so if we think about it in terms of the resilient facilities, the hub scale, each of those lily pads may be those hubs. And then you may have the model facility that helps with, to develop other facilities and inspire other facilities. And then, of course, there's all the support for those hubs, the connections to each other, connections to the private sector, connections to government, nonprofit organizations, all those things that have to work together to sustain that network. Next slide. And so when we talk about solutions, we also talk about solutions at each scale, just like we talked about the human needs at each scale. And so some of the things that we imagined were at the individual scale, it's about connection and connectivity and education. So there might be a LilyPad app that gives someone immediate access to their neighbors, to their local representatives. And when I say local representatives, I mean the people that are going to help them, that they can get in touch with in the event that they need help. At the neighborhood scale, it may be we envision what we call the LilyPad fleet, which is an aqueous vehicle fleet that on sunny days is out in the community educating people on how to be prepared for disaster on their own. But on those days where disaster strikes, they may be the vehicles that are actually going out and bringing people to safety. At the community scale, it might be the physical building, the hub itself, which in some communities would be the renovation or retrofit of an existing facility to make it more ready and more prepared. But we may find through the analysis that there's communities that don't have any of assets that could serve in that capacity. And so in those, it's important to make an intervention to make sure that they have that type of facility. And then, of course, the city scale is really where we imagine that these things start to be connected and that there's this infinitely scalable solution. Next slide. And so, there's a lot of discussion about resilience hubs. And I think what this idea and concept was really trying to drive home is that that we keep the communities and the individuals and the human needs at the center of all the conversations, and that we realize that the hub itself helps the community, but creating a network beyond that and connections beyond that is going to make each of those hubs more resilient as well. And so if we create this infinitely scalable network, then it can ebb and flow and react more quickly to anything that comes our way. And that's it. I'll pass it on.
Good evening. I am, as earlier said, Shannon Buggs, the Director of the Mayor's Office of Complete Communities. And on behalf of Mayor Turner, I do want to say thank you to AIA Houston Chapter and at-large Council Member David Robinson for including the Complete Communities Initiative in this important panel discussion about community scale resilience and its ability to improve the quality of life of Houstonians. Hi, Council Member, it's good to see you. Complete Communities is an equity initiative that moves Houston forward on expanding opportunity and rectifying injustices. And one reason we're doing this work is because every neighborhood in Houston should have an identity and a voice in its development. So we built an inclusive and responsive community planning process to elevate the voices of residents who have been ignored for too long. Every inequity that Houston needs to address exists in the Complete Communities. And for Houston to remain a city where people can start with nothing and make their way to a different place economically and socially, and actually, if you'll go back to that last slide, Mayor Turner grew up in a Complete Communities, Acres Home. He continues to live in that Complete Communities. And he talks about his journey from being the son of a maid who worked at the Rice Hotel in downtown Houston to being the mayor of the city of Houston and working in City Hall in downtown Houston. And it's that trajectory of economic mobility that we are trying to protect and move forward and keep as a part of Houston's culture. And for that to happen, we can't have neighborhoods that have pockets of economic distress and disinvestment. And we can't assume that the market will take care of everything. People in the complete communities are just like all of us on tonight's panel discussion and in the audience. They want to live near good schools, safe and fun parks, and businesses that cater to their needs and wants. Next slide, please. So what are the complete communities? This map shows you where all of them are here in the city of Houston, and they are the first 5 were designated in 2017, and the next 5 were in 2019. And 1 in 6 Houstonians live in the complete communities, and it represents 10% of the city's land are within the boundaries of the complete communities neighborhoods. These 10 neighborhoods represent the diversity of our city, with 25% of Houston's Black population, 19% of our Hispanic neighbors, and 19% of our Asian residents living in complete communities. My sound is a little fuzzy. Thank you. And although only 4% of white Houstonians live in complete communities, the total number of that portion of our population is just higher than the total number of Black residents in complete communities. And the Latinx community is the highest in total numbers with over 1 million complete communities residents. Next slide. Complete Communities is an equity initiative that addresses the economic disinvestment, health disparities, educational underachievement, environmental discrimination, and other social injustices that too many Houston communities have had to reckon with for decades. This slide shows the life expectancies differences between the KASHMERE Gardens neighborhood and one that is less than 10 miles away, the Washington Avenue Memorial Park area. You can see that people in KASHMERE Gardens are expected to live 20 years less than the people living in the Memorial Park, Washington Avenue area. Next slide, please. Earlier, the initiative was launched in 2017 and started with 5 pilot neighborhoods: Acres Home, Gulfton, Near North Side, 2nd Ward, and 3rd Ward. City Council adopted those action plans for the complete communities in August of 2018. Also in 2018, the Houston Endowment awarded the City of Houston a grant to facilitate the creation of the Mayor's Office of Complete Communities, and the Greater Houston Community Foundation, in collaboration with the city, launched the Complete Communities Improvement Fund to receive charitable donations. In 2019, I was hired as the inaugural director of the Mayor's Office of Complete Communities, and Mayor Turner announced the 2nd phase of the initiative with the addition of 5 more neighborhoods: Alief Westwood, Fort Bend Houston, KASHMERE Gardens, Magnolia Park Manchester, and Sunnyside. Complete Communities is a collaborative effort involving residents, community stakeholders, and all City of Houston departments and divisions, the city leadership from the Mayor's Office of Complete Communities, the Planning and Development Department, and the Department of Neighborhoods. Okay. If you, next slide, please. Sustainable neighborhoods are built on a foundation of functioning community assets or building blocks. But we also know, as Illya said earlier in his discussion about the hubs, that the foundation for a resilient future starts with hubs. Complete Communities, through its hub anchor partner projects, is focused on ensuring the 10 neighborhoods have foundational assets for their residents and business owners to succeed. We know that not every community is at the same place, so the initiative works closely with community stakeholders to increase impact and eliminate development redundancies. The hubs in the Complete Communities go, quote, beyond the traditional role of simply sheltering people and distributing relief materials, as Illya wrote. A signature capital project in every complete community will serve as a catalyst for other developments that improve the built environment and quality of life in the neighborhoods. We also need, as we are developing the initiative, a replicable and consistent project framework to plan and develop Complete Communities hub corridor anchor projects as the initiative continues to scale its impact and capabilities. Next slide. Neighborhood parks is one of our areas of equity that we address through Complete Communities. And as the COVID-19 pandemic has renewed Houstonians' appreciation for our parks and open spaces, we are all spending more time in the green spaces closest to our home. But many of us are seeing areas of need that are a result of deferred maintenance. And so for a year, the Greater Houston Partnership and the Houston Parks Board has engaged with the Houston Parks and Recreation Department and the Mayor's Office of Complete Communities in the effort to rethink how Houston city government and philanthropic community fund neighborhood parks. This 50-50 Park Partners program, as well as the Resilient Houston Strategy, Plan Houston, and HPAR's Master Plan, are all efforts that seek to enhance the green infrastructure in the Complete Communities and address the environmental injustices that have occurred in these neighborhoods. Next slide. We also are developing hub anchor projects. So the 4 signature capital projects selected for an engagement by a project management office team are the highest priorities for our residents and community stakeholders. They are the Bethune Empowerment Center and Acres Home, which will be a workforce development hub with middle skills training programs and small business owner support services. The Sunnyside Energy Solar Farm is positioned to accelerate the city's energy transition efforts, employ Sunnyside residents, and provide low-cost energy to neighborhood homes. The Fort Bend Houston area of our city is a food desert, far from a multitude of arts and culture venues that bolster our city's reputation as a performing and visual arts mecca. The Edison Arts Complex will transform the area with sit-down restaurants and performing arts venues with rentable spaces, and it will be similar to the Match in Midtown and the Deluxe Theater in Fifth Ward. And then we're looking also at the Alief Westwood area. Some of you may be well aware of the fact that Houston is the U.S. city with the highest rate of human trafficking, and the locus of most of the human trafficking activity in the United States is Bissonnette Street, a main commercial corridor in the Alief Westwood Complete Communities. but we also as a city are a model for municipal anti-human trafficking efforts. And so part of that work is to develop a social services hub that's focused on providing services and opportunities designed to curb the reach and impact of human trafficking and pushing Houston forward to work in economic development spaces to bring in social policy changes that will help to reduce trafficking in our city. So that gets to Illya's point that it's more than just environmental resilience, but several ways in social resilience. Next slide, please. In KASHMERE Gardens, specifically, we did some resilience planning work. So the KASHMERE Gardens Complete Communities Action Plan has 32 goals, 80 projects that are organized into 10 focus areas. And it also has an introductory section focused on COVID-19. The highest priority focus areas for the KASHMERE Gardens community stakeholders are economy and jobs, flood resilience, and safety. At the request of the residents in KASHMERE Gardens, Houston's Chief Resilience Officer, Marissa Aho, conducted a resilience public meeting in KASHMERE Gardens that led to the community incorporating Resilient Houston Strategy 17, which is develop lily pads to serve as neighborhood resilience hubs, into their action plan. And that action plan is being finalized now. Those action plans, again, were developed over the course of a year with input received in KASHMERE Gardens and 8 public in-person and virtual meetings, 5 surveys, and numerous neighborhood support team meetings. The neighborhood support team in KASHMERE Gardens is comprised of 55 residents, business owners, civic leaders, and community stakeholders who provided guidance, conducted outreach, and helped to shape the planning process for KASHMERE Gardens. And then, just so that you're aware, all of the complete communities have NSTs, and in the pilot round, those neighborhood support teams have either retained their community engagement phase structure of being a neighborhood support team, or they've evolved into working groups to facilitate implementation of the 10 focus group focus areas for each of the plans. Next slide. So in closing, I just want to reiterate that the Complete Communities Initiative in Houston is our best response to racial inequities, environmental injustices, economic disparities, and negative social factors. It is a collaborative approach to provide substantive, transformative support and resources in communities that have been systematically under-resourced for decades. But its success depends on public-private partnerships to identify and leverage the funding to implement lily pad networks and other solutions that will uplift the quality of life of all Houstonians. All of the funding that the city is able to use in terms of discretionary funding, from our community development block grant funding, how we met out the capital improvement funds, we're able to leverage that public funding with the private dollars that the philanthropic community provides for different projects and programs in the complete communities. So it truly is a collaborative effort that needs everyone's support and participation. And I appreciate you all giving me time to explain how we are incorporating hubs and corridors into this initiative.
Well, that was amazing. Thank you both for incredible presentations. I have a few questions for you both, if you don't mind, to kick off our discussion. It seems that we have 2 extraordinary initiatives. Shannon, I wanted to know, maybe I missed this, how long has your initiative been running with the City of Houston?
Since April of 2017.
Since 2017, okay.
So we're coming up on 3 years. I mean, 4 years.
About 4 years. So I wanted to ask you both about defining communities. Given that the geography of each of the communities, you know, there is maybe a set geography based on street grids and whatnot, but I think both of you illustrated that a community is defined in a different way. How do you contend with that, Shannon, first about the geography of the community? How do you define that to really express and answer those needs? And then I'm going to go over to you, Laura, to talk about projecting to the future for those community needs. So go ahead, Shannon, please.
So our neighborhood support teams actually helped us to define the boundaries. Houston has 88 super neighborhoods, that were developed in the 1980s. But a lot of the community has evolved beyond what those original boundaries look like. So when I talked about KASHMERE Gardens, the boundaries for it for our complete communities exceeds the boundaries of the super neighborhood. So we have a portion of Fifth Ward that's in there. We could have added in Trinity Houston Gardens, but there was a decision made by the residents of both KASHMERE Gardens and Trinity Houston Gardens that they did not want to add a portion of that super neighborhood in, even though the super neighborhood president for that community attends all of the KASHMERE Gardens complete communities meetings, because they are very clear that the gentrifying impacts that are happening in Fifth Ward and in KASHMERE Gardens will have an impact on Trinity Houston Gardens, so they are staying connected. We also expand the boundaries of Acres Home based on the reality of how people are living in that community. Sunnyside also had an expansion. With A-Leaf, we added a portion of Westwood into it based on the overflow of human trafficking and its impacts in that general area, and wanting to make sure that we had a cohesive plan that would address this and try to contain that problem into the areas where it is now. We also looked at, we added Second Ward as in the first round, and it was a natural progression to add Magnolia Park and the Manchester area to that, because a lot of folks, when they come into Second Ward, they don't realize they have driven into Magnolia Park or onto Manchester. They just know it all as the East End. And so it gives us some consistency and be able to provide solutions that can impact and assist both of those, all of those neighborhoods.
Thank you. Laura, so if the hubs that you're proposing really address these unique neighborhoods or whatnot, can you tell me a bit how you're defining the geography of the neighborhood, but moreover, how do you constantly redefine or project to the future? Because you mentioned project to the future, and that is really interesting to me. You've got population growth, shifting geographies of people, places, economies. So can you muse on that for a little bit and tell us how the hub really can respond to those things?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that I think is interesting that we talked about a lot is that disasters and threats and stresses, they don't know the political boundaries or the geographical boundaries that we make, right? And so it's about connections, it's about relationships. And we've seen a lot of that through hurricanes and now more recently through the pandemic, that, the types of things that started happening, there were supply chain challenges, right? And those that had connections beyond just the people sitting next to them, may have fared better in those situations. And so while you have to start somewhere and you have to define, an area that you're talking to and engaging, I think it's important to always be stretching beyond whatever, boundary that you're starting to set, and always be pushing yourself to say, do we have all the right people in this conversation? In terms of the future and envisioning the future, what I think is really interesting is obviously, the concept, the discussion of lily pads is very much kind of a play on words, right? With flooding, and that's what everybody had on their mind after Harvey, because they literally float above the danger. But it's very important, to realize, and we've said this all along, that that's not the only thing that we're going to face. And if we're only reacting to what happened in the past, then we're not going to be prepared for what's happening in the future. We can't always predict the future, but if we allow ourselves to step outside of the experiences that we've had in the past or in the present, and really kind of think bigger and learn from others, and just kind of envision, look at the trends and say, okay, what else could come our way? Then I think we'd be more prepared. I think if you ask Marissa Aho about, were you totally surprised by the pandemic? She would probably say, no, we've been talking about these types of things at a global scale for much longer. And so it's that type of thinking that she does that I think we all need to kind of, keep checking ourselves and think of. And so one of the things that we did is, after when the pandemic hit, we did kind of an internal exercise and said, well, let's run pandemic through the LilyPad network concept and see what that looks like, and start to look at what are those human needs at the different scales. And we found ourselves diving deeper into the concept of mobility and the concept of supply chain and health services and equity, and what people have access to. And those are all things that the pandemic has kind of exposed. So it's just, and to your point about looking at the future and how do you define it, I think the other thing that's important is it's a process. It's an iterative process that we have to go through. And so when a neighborhood is working through finding ways to be more resilient, it's not a conversation that happens today and everybody walks away. It's a conversation that starts today, and you move through it, and then you take steps, you create action plans, but there's that important step of coming back and then saying, okay, what have we done well? And let's re-envision what might be our challenges in the next 5 years, 50 years.
That's great, Laura. You bring up a lot of great things. I was going to ask you about how COVID has changed your thinking. So I'm going to send this back over to Shannon. So Shannon, since we've heard from Laura about the sort of change in thinking or additional layers of thought process into the LilyPad and its future, how has your program looked at not just the today that we're dealing with COVID, but what does that mean when you start to look at the community base, and what have those conversations look like to increase resilience from that hub that you're talking about into the geographies that are soft geographies? Can you tell us a little about that?
Sure. In addition to leading the Mayor's Office of Complete Communities, I am one of the 5 leaders of the Mayor's Health Equity Response Initiative and Task Force, along with Marissa Aho and Janice Weaver, who's our Director of Community Relations, Juliet Stepetch, Director of Education, Susan Christian, who is our Director of Special Events. She handles a lot of logistics. In this work, we've been able to accelerate a lot of what is needed in the complete communities and 17 other prioritized super neighborhoods based on community response and how they have, residents have identified their concerns. Oh, sorry, I thought this was off. We had a town hall, we did a survey, a citywide survey, where we aggregated the responses of the complete communities residents to find out exactly how COVID-19 was impacting them. A lot of unemployment, a lot of needs for bringing more workforce development training into the neighborhoods. We have a lot of transportation access problems. Food insecurity is an ongoing problem. And so part of our COVID-19 response has been to identify where the city can increase its own resilience and how it's going to address some of these long-term systemic problems. So Marissa has, in fact, identified a source of funding for us to bring some fellows in to deal with food access, equity outreach, and some other technology access, other issues that are long-term that need to have a complete solution developed and started to implement. We've been able to address with the CARES funding quite a bit of those needs, but that funding is very limited and has to be used by the end of this year. And so we know, based on the pandemic, just how deep these problems go. And we are working collaboratively with the county, the state, federal government as much as possible in order to bring more solutions to these problems.
That's wonderful. So if I can, so I want the audience to understand a couple things. This is going to go back to questions for both of you. So the idea of complete communities, which I think is wonderful, identifying the gaps and the vulnerabilities. You both discussed that, to really get rid of the weakest links or strengthen those weakest links. So that brings us to a place where we can make the community whole or make it more resilient. However, I want to take this a little further. If we're looking at the Houston of the future, what does regeneration look like? So in your case, Shannon, you said food, the sort of food issues, food desert issues, the plan for growing food yourself, or your front lawn to growing food, those types of things. So I'm just saying that I would like to hear from both of you. What does beyond resilience look like regeneration as a network possibility that you're both looking at? The diagram you showed, Laura, is that I've got these hubs, and the hubs now connect together in a network. Can you tell me what regeneration looks like from the network condition? And then I want to go back to you, Shannon. Given that the geographies you're looking at, we know that those boundaries are not fixed, right? And I want to go back to regeneration to you. So Laura, could you tell us a little bit about what regeneration might look like from the hub network standpoint?
Sure. So, I think the network itself acknowledges that not every community is going to be in the same place at the same time, right? And so when portions of the network are struggling or are going down, other parts of the network might step in and help regenerate those others. So, in one way that I might look at it is to say that it is the network itself that is constantly ebbing and flowing and moving resources, moving action plans, moving connections around where they need to go, because it is dynamic and it's not static. Not sure if that answers your question.
It does somewhat. Let's hear from Shannon. I think together we've got some good fodder for the next question. Go ahead.
When you asked about regeneration, it actually made me think not just about being able to grow food in our own lawns. And my parents both come from families that had farming backgrounds, and so they have always had a garden. And I don't know why, I don't know how to do all of that, but they are determined that my own children will know. And my parents live in the 3rd Ward. My children's other grandmother also lives in the 3rd Ward. And for me, regeneration and part of Mayor Turner's main goal in the reason to have complete communities is that people who grow up in these neighborhoods, who have community pride imprinted on them from their experiences of childhood, growing up in these neighborhoods. I grew up in a complete community, the Fort Bend, Houston area. He wants all of us to be able to say, yes, I want to stay in the neighborhood where I grew up. That's part of the regeneration, is having these neighborhoods receive the capital infusions that they need in order to have standard quality of life that we expect all Houstonians to be able to have, because we are a city of opportunity, but also for the next generation to be able to afford to stay there and want to stay there. Not feel like it's a sacrifice because the family is requiring me to hang on to this house, but that they genuinely see opportunity for themselves in their neighborhoods and can stay committed to those neighborhoods. And I have those conversations with my own children about wanting them to be committed to being here in Houston, keeping our best talents here. And when you lift up the entire quality of life, then you have more people willing to stay instead of exporting themselves to the coast because they think that's just going to be a more fun and more economically viable way of life, or more environmentally safe, right? We have a whole conversation happening now about energy transformation. That's also part of our regeneration conversation, because people, and I earlier had a coughing attack because of my allergies, right? And I thought I had turned the screen off. So I am living through the challenges also of all of this. And several of our complete communities want air quality monitoring systems put in place, right? So they can address the ongoing environmental concerns and make it still a healthy place for themselves and their children and their grandchildren to live. So I think there's lots of ways that we're looking at regeneration, but the most important is that these communities need to be an option for the next generation of Houstonians.
So that reinvestment in human capital,
Mhm.
and these places are now destinations as you grow up in your thinking. I think that's quite wonderful. That ties into circular economy, all of those pieces.
Mhm.
I want to ask you both about partnerships. Laura, how important is partnership? You alluded to it in your presentation about just not just in the thought process, but then tell us a little about that. But then what is the importance of partnership to actually realize a hub network and moving forward? So partnerships, please tell me what your thoughts are about partnerships surrounding the hubs in the process.
It's absolutely critical, and those partnerships are on a personal level. They're at a community level. So we envision partnerships with public sector, private sector, nonprofits, places of faith, all those things, all the components that bring a community together and make a community work. I think we can all acknowledge that the needs are always going to outweigh the funds that there are to accomplish those needs. And so there's a financial piece to that, but there's also a prioritization piece to that, and a buy-in. And so I think when you create partnerships, you've got more people that are more invested in pushing those initiatives forward, whatever they are, and then having building pride in whatever those interventions are. I think, Shannon, when you talked about making communities that people want to come back to and have pride, I think it's really important to teach a sense of place to our kids, right? And to teach them all the great things and all the challenges about where they live, because then as they grow up, they start to envision ways to help address those challenges. And that's yet another way that a partnership is important. You're bringing more thought process, more experiences into the conversation, and that can only make it better.
I agree, Laura. And I having grown up here in Houston, right, I did go off to school to the East Coast and came home. But one of the things I did not recognize was the value of so much free and readily available culture in our city, right? That's a big part of the partnerships that you're talking about. Is Miller Outdoor Theater is an available resource that helps us to fully understand the diversity of Houston because of the super engaging programming that they have to really reflect the diversity of our city. And going away, I was in college with in the Northeast with people from New York and Chicago and all these places. And of my friends who were African American, I was the only one who had seen Black operas. I had seen Treemonisha and Porgy and Bess at Miller Outdoor Theater because it was available here in Houston. And those kinds of partnerships that allow free resources to be available to people to elevate their experience of living in our city is at the heart of the public-private partnerships that we need for the collaborations in the complete communities. The residents have prioritized what's most important to them. And if they had all the money in the world, they would make everything in their action plans come to reality in 2 years and be done. We don't have that, right? And so what's been amazing about this Complete Communities initiative and the support we're seeing from the corporate community, including the AIA, which has helped us on housing, is that we can say directly to those interested in supporting the initiative, this is what the residents want done. This is what the community stakeholders have said is most important for them to see happen in the next 0 to 2 years, 2 to 5 years, or within 5 years. And that helps to focus where we put our money, where we put the emphasis, who steps forward to say, yes, I do want to partner with the city. I do want to partner with these residents. I do want to partner with these implementing partners. At the beginning of this, we've had a lot of different companies wanting to bring in national partners to facilitate some of the projects and programs. And some of that has been successful. But what really helps us is when we have companies, nonprofit organizations that want to work with those folks who have already been on the ground and help build up their capacity, so that we get back to, Illya, what you're talking about is the regeneration effect, right? And making sure that we are growing a system within our city that allows us to create Houston-centric solutions for national problems. What we're dealing with here is not unfamiliar to any other major city, but how we address it will make the difference of whether or not Houston retains its leadership capacity in the world, quite honestly. And as the energy capital, it is even more important that we have these conversations about resilience and not just expecting Houstonians to always be able to get over it, but really bring that community scale resilience into play so that our individuals are not just bouncing back, but that overall neighborhoods are continuing to elevate and grow.
You know, you bring up something about capacity, and brilliant, because each of your proposals, diagrams, and work, they really look at the community. And, you know, and this is nothing about a commentary about government. Government has a top-down facilitating role, right? If the community is a horizontal autonomous network, when a shock or stress hits, the community can operate absent of communication from the government. It can continue to operate. There's a resilience to that. So what I like about not only the diagram, the ideology, and what you're doing is you're creating capacity, the capacity to take shocks and stresses. So I'm not on the phone calling the government saying, hey, can you come and fix this? Can you come and fix this? Because capacity has been built to a certain degree. That also helps the community advance. And so I'm hearing really wonderful things. Have you learned from one another in terms of how you look at hubs? For example, Shannon, the way you've described hubs, really amazing. Laura, the way you're describing hubs is really amazing. You've referenced one another. How does that network work together? How have you informed one another? And so, you know, Shannon, when is the first lily pad going to be built in one of these neighborhoods, kind of thing? You know, just got to ask.
That gets back to the money question.
Right.
And we really did need to invite into this conversation Chief Resilience Officer Marissa Aho, who is advocating on a daily basis to get every one of the resilience strategies happening here in Houston. I don't know where she found the funds to get our heat mapping project done, but she did it, and we are getting the results from that. So in coordination with her, because the Complete Communities Initiative does fall under the Resilient Houston strategy, right? None of these initiatives are operating separately. They all are built on top of each other, and the Resilient Houston strategy is our overall umbrella strategy. And so as she finds funding and resources and partners, Stantec being one of them, to help us move forward all of this effort, she will let me know when we will get our first lily pad network going. And we know that the KASHMERE Gardens area is one of the first, but there's also been a lot of talk about Greens Point being another one. I do believe Setagas is another area that we've been looking at. So there's lots of areas of Houston where this can be. But again, as Laura was saying, and also you, Illya, the community can say, I don't need to wait on you all to get this done. Communities can come together and say, and in fact, with KASHMERE Gardens, the library has been out of commission in that neighborhood since Harvey. But it wasn't because of the flooding from Harvey. A pipe burst in the roof of it and flooded out. And so in our plans, we were adding where the lily pads could go in that neighborhood. And the community said back, do not leave our library out. Just because it's shut down right now doesn't mean that that's not where we want to go to feel safe. And they have already started building their plans for how they are going to reposition that building into the lily pad before anything else gets started, because they know that's where people go for higher ground and to feel safe.
That's great. Laura, I've got actually a question from the audience for you. Is gentrification causing a lot of problems for future generations in the neighborhoods? And how do you plan for that to make a solution set?
Well, and I think Shannon can probably speak more to that than I can, or more intelligently about it than I can. But I would say that there are absolutely challenges that are presented from that. And one of the things that Shannon mentioned earlier was, people having, growing up in a neighborhood and then having the funds and the ability to stay there or move back there. And when gentrification happens, that can cause challenges there, of course. And so, I think if we're looking at all of our communities and we're looking at equity within our communities and always striving to avoid a place where we let one community, be disengaged and, for a long period of time, and others, moving forward in a different direction. If we're always thinking about our neighbors and we're always working to bring us to the same level, that's a start.
Right. And so Shannon, to you, gentrification, we're starting to make these great neighborhoods. You're starting to really pull these to a complete community. Well, I want to live there. And so what is gentrification and how do you deal with that?
So we've been putting on place several different strategies related to this. So one is the Houston Land Bank and the Houston Community Land Trust approach, where we are helping the land bank to acquire land in order to build affordable housing on it. And then the land trust concept is where people can sell their property into the land trust so that the land is owned by the trust, but the family owns the house, the building on it, and they commit to reselling it if they choose to resell it at an affordable price. And so they don't have to take into account the land costs in order to have a wonderful home to raise their family in. And they have, I think, a lease for 99 years or something on it. I don't remember all of the details, but there are lots of approaches in trying to deal with housing on that. The other part that we are trying to get done is to increase people's ability to earn money in these neighborhoods so that as the tax rates go up, because there's not a lot we can do on, Houston has a revenue cap. There are all of the property tax concerns and how the property valuations are done. That's a whole other set of political conversations. But in terms of helping individuals and build up their resilience to address the ongoing threat to their ability to afford to live in their neighborhoods, we then want to put in job training programs. We want to improve the education in the schools that are in their local neighborhoods. We want in Acres Home, we worked with Workforce Solutions to bring a Workforce Solutions office to that neighborhood. We have been in conversations about green jobs and how we can increase the number of those here in the city of Houston, jobs for the future. We are, in fact, the Sunnyside Solar Farm is intended to be a workforce development initiative as well, as a way of taking a toxic former landfill and converting it into usable and good space for the community. So there are several things. We also have to address the social determinants of health, right? Part of the problems is that if you have very unhealthy people, they are not able to live in their homes as long as they need to for the next generation to be financially stable enough to inherit and keep the property, right? So if you look at health as a way of transferring generational wealth, we know that if you have family members dying in their 50s, when the next generation is just in their 20s, they're not going to be at a state where they are going to be able to afford all of what it takes sometimes, or have the interest in being able to manage a house. And so all of these things come into play. We have, through the Department of Neighborhoods, will-a-thons, where we help neighbors in some of our most economically distressed neighborhoods to develop a will so that they are not losing the property through probate court. Because there's one family member that's wants to do one thing and another wants to do something else, and it gets caught up in the taxes and all of that. There are lots of different approaches that we have to take in order to address the ongoing encroachment of it's not, encroachment is not right the word. Is not the right word. The economic development is what these neighborhoods have wanted and needed. They got redlined by banks and insurance companies, and the wealth that should have been generated in those neighborhoods bypassed them. And so it's not that we're trying to push or keep at bay economic development. We just want to do it in a way that still allows for the sustainability of the neighborhood. And so a lot of that is getting more affordable housing stock into the neighborhood, buying up land that will allow for that to happen. So that's the main component. And I did want to say that the houses that AIA Houston chapter designed for some of our complete communities, the affordable housing, are really tremendous, right? To get those smaller homes that have grace and style to them, that set a new aesthetic standard, that's in harmony with what's already there, is a real tribute to the work that architects can do to help keep that affordable housing component exciting and enticing for folks. They don't want to feel like they have to just live in a box in order to be able to live in the neighborhood of their choice.
Thank you, Shannon. That's amazing. We're running down on time, so there is one last question in the chat, and then I'm going to have Rusty come on for 30 seconds before Catherine and I sum this up. But I think you just described the regeneration I was looking for. You're taking the sort of the brownfield sites of the 20th century, turning them into the profit of the 21st century through innovation that is the underpinning of what Houston has been since it was founded. That's amazing. So the question is from Holly. What can we do as individuals to help create and nourish the lily pad? Anyone have an answer for that? I mean, look, you guys are looking for money and donations. That's part of it. But I think some of the education, and I'm not joking, if there's, great. Laura, what do you think? What could that possibly be from the standpoint individuals? What do you think?
Step one, what I love about the conversation of resilience is that the more people you bring into the conversation, the more that you learn, and the more that we learn from each other. And so I think having the conversations and looking around and starting to see what's missing in this community, how can we help? And really putting aside the individualistic thinking, and starting to realize that if we build up our communities together, we're benefiting ourselves in that way. And so, I think we talked a lot about relationships. I think what's important is that it's symbiotic relationships, and that's where that regeneration, comes in, right? Because it just continues. And so I think it's having the conversations, keeping your eyes open, and creating those relationships.
That's wonderful. Thanks. Thank you both. Go ahead, Shannon.
Laura's point about what's missing, right? That is part of why we call it the complete communities. We already know there's a lot that's amazing and wonderful in these neighborhoods, but we also know that there are things that are missing, and helping the residents to find and put those missing pieces back into their neighborhoods is so critically important. And so for the Lily Pad Network, individuals can help. There's a lot of different programming that we can get started. And so we will build out a list to let you know what it's going to take. I don't have the answer right now for the individual approach to helping the lily pads get up and running, but I do know we can work with the different organizations like the AIA. We can work with Stantec, others, to figuring out how we get it launched. And we will speak back with you. And I know David Robinson will make sure that we
there he is. Hey, David.
Are responsive and
brilliant.
Get this moving forward. He and Marissa talk often, and I would have unmuted her because she may have an idea right now about the individuals, but I know that there are some collective things that we can be doing.
Well, if I may jump in.
Marissa wrote in. Yeah, let me just say before you, Catherine, that Marissa wrote in the chat space, I look forward to working with y'all. So we have plenty of work to do. Thank all the panelists, and Catherine, take it away.
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to give a shout out for our upcoming program early next year that we're working together with Director Buggs and others at the city to have a charrette that will focus on some of these complete communities, to carry these thoughts forward, and start to come up with some real solutions that can be eventually implemented, and help the neighborhood, help the residents get their ideas out, and on paper in ways that we can communicate to others what is possible. So I encourage everyone to look for that coming up early next year.
Yes, that's a preview of all the great things that are coming. So thank you, Catherine.
Director, let's work on that list together too. I really want to take that last question seriously. If individuals or architects within our chapter want to help, there are ways tangibly, and it's really part of the purpose of the whole program has been to try to think as practitioners, professionals, what can we do to help the city make ourselves stronger, more resilient, and work, as the mayor has said, it's not enough, and we were discussing it this morning in the Architect Center, not enough for us to build back, we must build forward.
This is true.
David, that's really great. And so one thing Rusty asked for 30 seconds, but one thing that I've found over the years, resilience is an action. It is not an object. So you just asked how I can help. Brilliant. So Holly, thanks for asking that. You've really sort of embodied resilience is an action. The act of doing, the act of being a neighbor, the act of everything you've heard today is about resilience. And so I think that's really brilliant.
And Rusty, let me also say to the director before we get from Rusty that complete communities, remember that complete is an adjective and it is a verb. And that's, we must complete.
I love it.
Very true.
Rusty, you're muted.
I know you think I had that figured out by now. Thank you all for a great program. And Director Buggs, we do stand ready to help at AIE Houston. Our members are ready to help complete communities. And this was a terrific program, by the way. The reason I asked for 30 seconds, I want to tell you just a little story. Today has been sort of a day of reflection and remembrance. The mayor came to the Architecture Center. He was guest number one. We haven't even really moved in yet. Councilman Robinson brought him to the Architecture Center, and it was terrific to have him there. So it's been a little bit of an emotional day for me. Been remembering Hurricane Harvey. That's what you see on the floor behind Catherine, is Hurricane Harvey, and then there's a track of all the other hurricanes that have hit Texas in history. When Hurricane Harvey hit, the second day of it, that day that the storm parked over us and the rain was flowing down, the Architecture Center was under 4 feet of water. We didn't, I didn't know that by that time. What I did know is that my phone number had been published as the phone number for the fire chief. So I was getting calls at least, I think we were 1 digit apart. So I was getting calls at least every 6 minutes or so on how people offering help along the Gulf Coast. I was also getting calls from executive directors of AI chapters from across the country and how they could help. But the one that I remember the most is Illya Azaroff called me and said, "We have been through this before. We can get through this. Tell me how I can help you." At AIA, we talk a lot about Black Cape architects, and that is a phenomenon that needs to go away. Those famous architects that parachute into your city and they do museums and then they go away. If you want to talk about a real architectural superhero, that's it right there, Illya Azaroff. And so thank you, my friend, for being here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thanks. Catherine, did you want to close us out with any final thoughts?
Yeah, and I just want to echo everyone's thanks for you guys putting on this panel. It was a really helpful discussion, and getting a lot of the ideas out there and hearing a lot about the concrete solutions that are in progress and that we can all be part of. So I really appreciate that. I was struck by, what you said early on, Illya, about how, we have these tipping points like Harvey, And once that happens, you can't go back to the way it was. And with COVID and everything happening this year, everyone, you hear sometimes we got to get back to normal. We can't get back to whatever we were before. So following Mayor Turner's advice of you can't build back. If you build back, you're building to fail. You must build forward and build better. And so what I'm inspired by this conversation is that we have such strength in our community in order to keep us going in a forward positive direction. So thank you all. And I just, that's all we've got today. So I encourage everyone to check out the website at houston2020visions.org. Check out the exhibit and find out ways to get plugged in and get engaged and help us all move forward.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you, AI Houston, and thanks for all of your friendship over the years. And I'm always available to continued help anytime you need it.
Thank you.
And a real pleasure.
Thank you. It's been very wonderful. I appreciate it. Good night.